Hey everybody, welcome back to these Behavior Revolution scriptures. We're diving into the book of 1 Kings today, and my son Mikey and I did a pretty cool presentation on it back in February, and we only got to the first chapter. So I think it's pretty important that we revise ourselves on the first chapter first, and then in a few days we'll start recording fresh the second chapter of 1 Kings. Thought it was a bit silly to re-record the first chapter since we've already did it. But now that we've been through the whole intensive study about David's inspiration and the new praise behavior that he brought in to combine with Moses' sacrificial system. And then, of course, he laid out all the groundwork. He prepared for this temple that he wasn't even allowed to build. Solomon built the temple. That's what we're going to study when we look at 1 Kings and all the other kings that came after them. Some were good, some were bad. Some were wicked and some were righteous. So I'd like to take you through this first video of 1 Kings today. So enjoy that, and then we'll get into chapter 2. Thank you.
Hey brothers and sisters, I'm Micah, and this is the Behavior Revolution Scriptures. So, before my dad starts chapter 1 with you, I just want to go through with you what the book of Kings is about, and summarize. Although 1st and 2nd Kings are two separate books in our scriptures, they were originally written as one book, telling a unified story that continues on from the book of Samuel that came before it. So David has unified the tribes of Israel into a kingdom, and Yahuah promised that from his line would come a deliverer and king who would establish Yahuah's kingdom over the nations and fulfill the promises he once made to Abraham. So the book of Kings tells the story of the long line of kings that came after David, and none of them lived up to that promise. In fact, they ran the nation of Israel right into the ground. The book is designed to have 5 main movements. The story begins and ends focusing on Jerusalem, first with Solomon's reign in the building of the temple, and then in the last section ending with Jerusalem's destruction and Israel's exile to Babylon. And the story leading up to this tragedy is what makes up the center 3 sections, which explain how Israel split into 2 rival kingdoms, how Yahuah tried to prevent the corruption of Israel by sending the prophets, and how exile became the only option to punish Israel's sin. The book opens with 2 chapters about the kingdom passing from the aging David to his son Solomon, and David's final words to Solomon. They are very similar to those of Moses and Joshua and Samuel to the people, telling them to remain trustworthy and obedient to the commands of the blood covenant and to give allegiance to Yahuah alone. But David's words ring somewhat hollow here, because David and Solomon then go on to discuss how they're going to join this new kingdom together by killing a whole heap of people. So it's not off to a great start, is it? Solomon's brightest moment comes when he asks Yahuah for wisdom to lead Israel, and he even completes David's dream to make a temple for the Elohim of Israel. Then the story actually stops and describes the design of this amazing temple in great detail, just like the tabernacle design when it was given to Moses. There's all these gold and jewels and images of angels and fruit trees, and it's all alluding back to the Garden of Eden, where the very first interdimensional portal connection occurs. The place where heaven and earth meet, and where Yahuah's presence dwells with his people. But no sooner does Solomon finish the temple than he makes really horrible choices, and the kingdom falls apart. He starts marrying the daughters of other kings, hundreds of them, for political alliances. And then he adopts their gods and goddesses and introduces the worship of those false idols into Yisrael. Solomon then accumulates huge amounts of wealth. He builds a huge army. He even brought back slave labor for all of his building projects. Now, if you go back to the instructions given to Moses in the Torah and look at Yahuah's guidelines for Yisrael's kings, Solomon is actually breaking every single one of them. So by the time that he dies, Solomon resembles the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, more than he does his own father, David. The next section of the book opens with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, behaving just as wicked as his father, and it's a very sad story of greed and lust for power. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor, and under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes reject this. They rebel, split, and form their own rival kingdom. And so now in the story, you have the southern kingdom, Judah, in Jerusalem with kings from the line of David. And now this new northern kingdom called Yisrael, whose capital will be Samaria. Eventually, Jeroboam also goes on to build 2 new temples to compete with Solomon's temple in the south. He puts a golden calf in each one to represent the Elohim of Yisrael, reminding us of the connection to Exodus 32 and the golden calf at Sinai. And it's all quite explicit from this point on. The story goes back and forth from north to south, tracing the fate of both kingdoms. Each one had about 20 successive kings, and as the author introduces each king, he evaluates their reign by a few criteria. Did they worship the Elohim of Yisrael alone, or did they promote the worship of other false deities as well? Did they deal with the looming idolatry among the people, and did they remain trustworthy in the loyal obedience to the blood covenant like David? Or did they become corrupt and unjust? And according to this criteria, the author finds no good kings in northern Israel, 0 for 20. And then in southern Judah, only 8 out of 12 get a positive rating, which connects to another huge purpose in this book, and that's to introduce the roles of the prophets, key figures in Israel's history. So in the scripture, prophets were not magicians or fortune tellers, rather they spoke on behalf of Yahuah. And so they kind of played a role of blood covenant watchdogs, which means they called out idolatry and injustice among the kings and the people. They were constantly reminding Israel of their calling to be a light, a shining example and witness to the nations, and that they should obey the commands given to Moses. And so the prophets commanded Israel to repent and follow Yahuah once again. In these center sections for each king, Yahuah then raises up prophets to hold them accountable. The most prominent prophets are the northern ones, Elijah and his student Elisha, right here in the center of the book. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet, living out in the desert, and his arch nemesis was the northern king, Ahab, and his Canaanite wife, Jezebel. Together, these two had instituted the worship of the Canaanite deity Baal over Yisrael. And so, in a famous story, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to whose Elohim, Mighty One, was real. So they both built altars and pray, Elijah to Yahuah and the pagan prophets to Baal. But only the Elohim of Yisrael answers with fire. After this, Ahab uses his royal power to murder a Yisraelite farmer and then steal his family's vineyard. And Elijah again confronts Ahab's injustice, and he announces the downfall of his house. Elijah eventually passes the mantle of his prophetic leadership to a young student named Elisha, who asks for double the authority that Elijah had. And what's fascinating here is how the author has recounted 7 miraculous feats for Elijah, and then he offers stories of 14 acts of power from Elisha. Both prophets were clearly remarkable men, and they played the same role, confronting Israel's kings for idolatry and injustice. But ultimately, they were unsuccessful in turning Israel back from idolatry and apostasy. In the next section, the northern kingdom is rocked by a bloody revolution started by a king named Jehu, who destroys Ahab's family. And although Jehu was at first commissioned by Yahuah, his violence just gets out of control, and it creates this spiral of political assassinations and rebellions from which Israel never recovered. Coup follows coup after Jehu, and each coup follows coup after Jehu, and each king follows other idols and also horrible injustice. And it all leads up to 2 Kings 17, when the big bad empire of Assyria swoops down and takes out the northern kingdom altogether in the capital city of Samaria. It's conquered, and the Israelites are exiled and scattered throughout the ancient world. Now, chapter 17 is key. The author stops the story and offers this prophetic reflection on what's just happened. He blames the downfall of the northern kingdom on the idolatry and blood covenant disobedience of Israel and its kings. And so now Yahuah has allowed them to face the consequences of their wicked decisions. The final movement of the book tells the story of the lone southern kingdom. And here we meet some very heroic kings, like King Hezekiah, who trusts Yahuah when the armies of Assyria come knocking on Jerusalem's door, or King Josiah, who discovers this lost scroll of the Torah in the temple and starts reading it. He's convicted, and he institutes massive reforms to remove idolatry and Canaanite influences from the land. But Judah is just too far gone. The king right in between these two is King Manasseh, and he's the worst by far. For not only does he introduce the worship of idol statues in Yahuah's temple in Jerusalem, he also brings in child sacrifice as well. And so Yahuah sends prophets to say, the time is up. Yisrael has reached the point of no return. And the final chapters tell the story of the Babylonian Empire coming to invade Jerusalem, destroying the Temple of Solomon, and carrying the people and the royal line of David off into exile. And so the story ends, leaving us wondering, is Yahuah done with Israel? Is he done with the line of David? Or are they forever exiled and divorced? Well, the final paragraph of 2 Kings zooms about 40 years forward into the exile, and it tells a very odd story. It's about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David who would have been king if he was back in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon releases him from the prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life. And then the book ends. So it's not much, but it's a story that gives a glimmer of hope that Yahuah has something planned involving the line of David. So the question now is, how is Yahuah going to fulfill his promises to Abraham and to David? How is he going to bless the nations and bring about his royal kingdom? And to answer those questions, we have to read on into the wisdom and prophetic books. But for now, that's the Book of Kings. And spoiler alert, we know that Yahusha's going to do it all. Thanks, brothers and sisters. Now my dad's going to come and take you through chapter 1.
Thanks, Mikey. Fantastic. Wasn't it wonderful? Now we know where we're going, brothers and sisters, in the whole Book of Kings for the next couple of months. So let's dive into it. We're going into the first chapter of Kings today, and it's all about kings. Let's have a look. Essentially, the Book of Kings will take us from the era of David, handing the throne over to Solomon, all the way down to Nebuchadnezzar, destroying Jerusalem and taking Judah captive, and Yisrael's exile into Babylon. The first 11 chapters of the Book of Kings are about King Solomon and his 40-year reign over a united, prosperous, and influential kingdom of Yisrael. So let's go. All the events of this chapter here today occur with such urgency, spanning only a few short hours. This is like watching it in real time almost. It's only a few hours this takes, this chapter. A lot of wheeling and dealing have got to go on. So, 1 Kings chapter 1. King David was now an old man, and he always felt cold, even under a lot of blankets. Unlike Moses, who was still of good health and still had excellent eyesight at the age of 120 years before his death, David is frail and in ill health at the age of only 70, due to a lifetime of stress, battle, living in extreme conditions in the desert, wilderness, exposure and fatigue. So he's old and he's cold. One day his officials said, "Your Majesty, we'll go look for a young woman to take care of you. Then she can lie down beside you and keep you warm." So they looked everywhere in Yisrael until they found a very beautiful young woman named Abishag, who lived in the town of Shunem. Then they brought her to David and she took care of him. But David did not have sex with her. Very important to clarify that, because they weren't bringing him a concubine or anything like that. This was purely to look after him. It was a standard medical practice from that era and still taught today as an emergency treatment for hypothermia. A person who had been overly exposed to cold and their core body temperature is dangerously low ought to snuggle closely with someone else to absorb the body heat that other person is generating. You can use towels and blankets and all sorts of stuff, but those things don't generate heat. They might these days, electric blankets and stuff, but back then, the best form of heat was another person lie right next to them to warm him up. Adonijah was David's fourth son from Haggith and was Absalom and Tamar's younger brother. Remember those two players? Absalom's just been killed not long ago for usurping the throne and wanting to take it over. He also killed his stepbrother for raping Tamar. Remember all that we just went through? So now we've got Adonijah, which is David's fourth son, who was very handsome. One day, Adonijah started bragging, "I'm going to make myself king." So he got some chariots and horses and hired 50 men as bodyguards. And David did not want to hurt his feelings, so he never asked Adonijah why he was doing all these crazy things. It might look like he's following in Absalom's footsteps, trying to usurp the throne. But this was not an outright rebellion. Rather, Adonijah just assumed he was next in line for the throne, since his three older brothers, Amnon, Absalom, and Chileab, were dead. Now, Amnon was the one who raped his stepsister Tamar. Absalom was just died not long ago. Got caught in the tree, remember? And Joab killed him. And Chileab, not much is mentioned about him, but we assume that he's dead as well. Because this guy, he just thought, I'm next in line. Let's start partying. My father's nearly dead. It's time for me to step up. So he started taking matters into his own hands. Adonijah, also a very handsome man, was just copying the political campaigning of his dead brother Absalom, as well as the total disrespect towards his father. Since David was an overly indulgent father who never disciplined his sons, they obviously felt entitled and arrogant. So, he's on the way to the throne, he thinks. Adonijah met with Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and Abiathar, the high priest. This high priest was loyal to the northern tribes. And he asked them if they would help him become the king. And both of them agreed to help. But Zadok, the other high priest, the one that was loyal to the southern tribes, Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, Nathan the prophet, Shimei, Ray, and David's bodyguards, they all refused to help him. So Adonijah invited his brothers and David's officials from Judah to go with him to Crawling Rock near Rogel Spring, where he sacrificed some sheep, cattle, and fat calves. But he did not invite Nathan, Benaiah, the bodyguards, or even his own brother Solomon. You guys didn't want to help me, so you're not invited to my inaugural party. There he is there, doing what he wants to do there. Chariots and horses. And when Nathan heard what had happened, he asked Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, "Have you heard that Adonijah has made himself king? And David doesn't know a thing about it." You and your son Solomon will surely be killed unless you do what I say. Go to David and say, you promised me that Solomon would be the next king. So why is Adonijah now king? And while you're talking to David, I'll come in and confirm everything you're saying. He's talking to Bathsheba here. He's stretching the truth a little bit because Adonijah has not made himself the king. He's purely saying that I'm next and I'm getting ready and let's party and celebrate. He hasn't actually declared that I am the king yet. But meanwhile, David was in his bedroom where Abishag was taking care of him because he was so old. And Bathsheba went in and bowed down. What can I do for you, my dear? David asked. Bathsheba answered, my king, you promised me in the name of Yahuah, your Elohim, that my son Solomon would be the next king. But Adonijah has already been made king. Not really. Without you even knowing about it. He sacrificed a whole lot of cattle, calves and sheep and invited Abiathar the high priest, Joab your army commander, and all your sons to be there except Solomon, your loyal servant. My king, everyone in Israel is waiting for you to announce who will be the next king. So if you don't, they'll say that Solomon and I have rebelled and treat us like criminals and kill us as soon as you die. Why is she so freaked out about being killed? The one who becomes king usually executes others in his family who might be seen as a threat to his crown, whether that threat is real or imagined. And Bathsheba would not have been popular, as you can imagine, among David's other wives and children, given all the stuff that went down. Just then Nathan the prophet arrived. Someone told David that he was there, and Nathan came in, bowing with his face to the ground. Then said, my king, did you say that Adonijah would be king? Earlier today he sacrificed a whole lot of cattle, calves, sheep, and invited the army commanders, Abiathar and all your sons, to be there. Right now they're eating and drinking and shouting, long live King Adonijah. But he didn't invite me, or Zadok the high priest, or Benaiah or Solomon. Did you say they could do this without telling the rest of us who'd be the next king? Why David's on his deathbed and couldn't be bothered to name a king yet is beyond me. It seems just like he's happy to let them fight for it themselves. He's had enough of them. But anyway, David says, tell Bathsheba to come in here. So she came back in and stood in front of him, and he said, the living Yahuah, Elohim of Yisrael, has kept me safe. And so today I will keep the promise I made to you in his name, and Solomon will be the next king. And Bathsheba bowed with her face to the ground and said, my king, I pray that you will live a long time. How can he be living a long time if he's about to die? In this discussion of death and eternal life, more is being implied under the surface. Yahuah had promised David that his dynasty would go on indefinitely and that he'd never replace it with another. Further, its continuation would go on through David's son Solomon. So Bathsheba is telling the dying David that what he's done by formally appointing Solomon as king, in accordance with Yahuah's will, is to bring about his own ongoing afterlife and eternal continuation of his dynasty. This is because it was still believed in Israel, as elsewhere, that a man's life essence lived on in his son. And in David's case, his kingship would also live on in his son Solomon and in his sons after him. And so one could say, in a very real and tangible sense, that David would be king forever. This was meant as a comfort to David, not as flowery, idle words. That's why she says, you will live a long time, because they believed back then that you lived on through your children. Not just as we would say it, but their actual real essence. The essence that we know is asleep and their body dead in the ground, they believe lives on through your children. So it's very spooky back here, very cosmic. Then David said, "Tell Zadok, Nathan, and Benaiah to come here." And when they arrived, he told them, "Take along some of my officials and have Solomon ride my own royal mule to Gihon spring." They had to go to a spring because apart from being anointed with oil, a fresh king had to be immersed as well, ceremonially washed. So they needed to have a spring, fresh water. To take my royal mule to Gihon spring. When you get there, Zadok and Nathan will anoint Solomon. They'll anoint Solomon the new king of Yisrael. Then after the ceremony is over, have someone blow a trumpet and tell everyone to shout, "Long live King Solomon!" Bring him back here and he'll take my place as king. He is the one I've chosen to rule both united nations of Yisrael, north and Judah in the south. A united nation of Yisrael. We'll talk about that united nation at the end of the episode, but it wasn't just assumed. He could have chosen one king for each, the north and another king for the south if he'd wanted to. He doesn't. He wants it to stay united, as he's just fought the better part of his life to unite them all. So do that. Solomon will be king. And Benaiah answered, "We will do it, your majesty. And I pray that Yahuah, your Elohim, will let it all happen. Yahuah has always watched over you, and I pray that he'll now watch over Solomon. May Yahuah help Solomon be an even greater king than you." An even greater king than you. Of the two high priests who served David at that time, Abiathar and Zadok, only Zadok was the Torah authorized high priest, because only he was of the proper lineage. Remember all those priest wars we dealt with? You had to be from Aaron's firstborn, whereas Abiathar was from the line of Eli, which was Aaron's youngest son. Remember that chart we looked at? And so with Zadok doing, if you want to see that chart, go to the beginning couple of episodes of 1 Samuel. And so with Zadok doing the anointing, future generations could not dispute the validity of the ceremony. That's why David said, "Get Zadok," because he's from the official line, Aaron's firstborn. No one will dispute this decision because the proper priest did it, high priest. So Zadok, Nathan, and Benaiah left and took along the two groups of David's special bodyguards. Solomon rode on David's royal mule as they led him to Gihon spring. Zadok the high priest brought some olive oil from the set-apart tent where the ark was and poured it on Solomon's head to anoint him as the new king. A trumpet was blown and everyone shouted, "Long live Solomon!" Then they played flutes and celebrated as they followed Solomon back to Jerusalem, making so much noise that the ground shook. Adonijah and his guests had almost finished eating. This ceremony is happening. Solomon's being anointed, and Adonijah's over there having a pre-anointing feast. He thinks he's next in line. It's all happening. So Adonijah and his guests had almost finished eating when they heard the noise. Joab also heard the trumpets and asked, "What's all that noise about in the city?" Just then Jonathan, son of Abiathar, came running up. "Come in, an important man like you must have good news," Adonijah said. But Jonathan answered, nah, mate, I don't, sorry. David's just announced that Solomon's the king. Your bro Solomon rode David's own royal mule to Gihon spring, and Zadok, Nathan, Benaiah, and the king's royal bodyguards went with him. Then Zadok and Nathan anointed Solomon the king. Now everyone's celebrating all the way back to Jerusalem. That's the noise you can hear in the cities, mate. Solomon's now king, not you, you buff. And get this, David's own officials even told him that they pray Elohim will help Solomon to be an even greater king than David is. I mean, what about that? You buffhead, celebrating before you've been told. In fact, Solomon was actually the least likely to be king, as the youngest of David's living sons, and likely no older than late teens. So he's definitely not in line, is he? He's not fourth, fifth, sixth. He's way down the line of sons. And he's from Bathsheba, the least popular wife because of the affair and everything. And he's only in his late teens. So they probably didn't even give him a second thought. He's also the product of a scandalous situation, being David and Bathsheba's second son, after the first died as punishment for their adulterous affair. And even though David and Bathsheba were married when Solomon was conceived, neither Bathsheba nor Solomon would have been very welcome in the harem or respected by the Israelite community at large. The whole seedy thing was tainted with adultery and murder and favoritism. So Solomon was the least likely to be in line for the king. But that's how Yahuah still today moves, isn't it? The least likely people get chosen or worked with, raised up. He takes the nothing, the nobody, the scum, the base things, puts his spirit in them and makes them remarkable to confound the world, the wise. David was in his bed at the time of the celebration, but he bowed and prayed, "I praise you, Yahuah Elohim of Yisrael, for you have made my son Solomon king and have let me live to see it." And Adonijah's guests shook with fear when they heard this news, and they all left as fast as they came. And Adonijah himself was petrified of what Solomon might do to him. So he ran to the set-apart tent and grabbed hold of the corners of the altar for protection. I mean, think about it. This boy, Solomon, would have grown up. He didn't have any other brothers because his older brother died at birth, practically. And he's the son of Bathsheba. So imagine what everybody was been saying about Bathsheba. What a hoe bag she must have been. So among all the royal wives, so how would the boys have treated Solomon? How would the sons have treated Solomon? What kind of cruel taunting and teasing and bullying would he have experienced? Clearly, because they wouldn't have had much discussion about Solomon being king, because they would have never suspected it, because he's practically the youngest. And yet Adonijah here is shaking with fear. So what kind of seeds of hatred have they all been sowing into this young boy, Solomon, who's now become a man? Anyway, he's been made king, and this guy's freaking out. He's run to the set-apart place, the tent, whatever kind of tent they had functioning at this point. It's where the ark was. And he's grabbed onto the altar. Remember the altar with all the gold altar with all the horns around it and stuff? He's grabbed onto the horns for protection. Because if you were accused of, if someone was after you to kill you, you could run to one of these places as a safe town, remember? All that Levitical stuff. And someone told Solomon, "Adonijah's all afraid of you now. He's all scaredy cat, clutching onto the altar for dear life, insisting you promise not to kill him." Why would they assume Solomon wanted to kill him? It's not said, but the dynamic between brothers, yeah. So Solomon answered, "If Adonijah doesn't cause any more trouble, I won't hurt him. But if he does, I'll have to kill him." Then he sent someone to the altar to get Adonijah. And when he arrived, Adonijah bowed down, and Solomon said, "Adonijah, go home. Go on. Get out of here." So as of this moment, Solomon is king of a united Yisrael. David is technically no longer king, but retains a kind of symbolic seniority until he dies. Solomon, like David, will be king over Judah and Yisrael, which was not automatic or a given, and needed to be clarified. David could have easily made everybody happy by making Solomon the king over Judah, pleasing Bathsheba, and making Adonijah king over the northern tribes. They were all the people he was trying to campaign anyway, just like his older brother. Could have made him the king over the northern tribes, keeping the custom of the firstborn inheritance, He's the oldest, you're next in line for the throne. You can have the northern tribes then. They don't like us anyway. But he doesn't do that. And even though the Hebrews won't get over their political factions and squabbles, still identifying themselves as north and south and all that madness, Yisrael is in fact a united sovereign nation of 12 tribes for now. And something like this has not happened since the time of Joshua, when they first went into the land. They were identified as 12 tribes of Yisrael. So, and then it all went to hell, and then David has been fighting the better part, as I said, to unite them all. And he has. And now Solomon's going to continue as the king over all 12 tribes. So that's where we're at, guys. This is the opening chapter of Kings. Solomon is now the king. I think we've got one more chapter, maybe two, where David's still having some things to say. But Solomon is now the official king. So, and we know where we're going. You heard the introduction Micah gave us all. It's very exciting where we're headed. It starts with Solomon's crown of esteem and uniting the nations, keeping them united, and it ends, the end of Kings, with captivity of all 12 tribes, the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So we've got our work cut out for us the next couple of months. Welcome to Kings, brothers and sisters. Be back soon.
Check it out. Check it out. Ain't it funky now?